Today's video is going to cover Chapter 7, Stimulus Control. So far we've been talking about laying some groundwork and then getting into things like reinforcement, extinction, and punishment. And in those three more recent topics, we've seen the importance of consequences in the control of operant behavior. But consequences aren't the only factor that are influencing operant behavior. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about antecedents, which are stimuli or events that precede operant responses. So here we have what Skinner called the three-term contingency, A, B, and C. So far we've been talking about B and C, a behavior and the subsequent consequence. You'll also sometimes see this called a response and an outcome. You may have already heard the terms S, R, and O when it comes to learning, and those terms will come up later on in this course. Here we're calling them antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So we're going to take that behavior leading to a consequence, and we're going to add in an antecedent. And like we already said, antecedents are the stimuli, events, situations, or circumstances, the conditions that are going to be present when this particular behavior occurs. So we're kind of saying in the presence of A, B will cause C or will lead to C. When we have some understanding of this antecedent in a particular operant behavior, then we have possession of information on the circumstances or the context or the situation in which a particular behavior was either reinforced or punished or was undergoing extinction. So what was the consequence of that particular behavior when this antecedent was present? Now we're going to be using the term antecedent and controlling stimulus pretty much interchangeably from here on out. So the symbol that we're using here is S from the stimulus part, because we have it listed here, antecedent or stimulus. So just don't be confused, the two terms are used interchangeably here. So when we're talking about a controlling stimulus, we're basically saying any stimulus or event that's changing the probability of an operant behavior occurring. And we have two types of these antecedent controlling stimuli. So the first is a discriminative stimulus, shortened to SD. So a discriminative stimulus is a stimulus or event that precedes an operant and sets the occasion for its reinforcement. We can also talk about setting the occasion for its punishment here, or we can also talk about punishment. We will be doing so later on. Just when we're getting used to the terms at the beginning, we're going to focus on the reinforcement side of things because that's a little bit easier to visualize. But discriminative stimuli don't just apply to reinforcement. And when we talk about an operant, we can also say an operant behavior or just a behavior. The terms, again, are all used fairly interchangeably. But this SD is basically a condition where we know that doing a particular behavior is going to be rewarded or reinforced is the correct way to say that. Our second option is an extinction stimulus, or an S delta. So this little triangle here is the Greek symbol delta. If you've taken most science courses, you'll have seen it previously, usually used to indicate a change in something. But for us, that S delta is basically a stimulus or event that's preceding an operant and sets the occasion for its non-reinforcement. Basically, it's the opposite of an SD. So an SD tells us when it's going to be reinforced, and an S delta is anything where it's not reinforced. And this duality here kind of makes sense. our behaviors don't occur randomly. They occur in very specific circumstances, and they can be reinforced differently based on the circumstances. So if you put your hand up in class, not so much online classes, but when you're in person, you can put your hand up and the teacher will call on you so you can answer a question or ask a question. But if you put your hand up while you're sitting in the library, then maybe that's not going to have any effect at all because the situation or the environment isn't right for reinforcement. So being in class would be a discriminative stimulus because you know that putting up your hand will get you to the desired outcome, but putting your hand up in the library, so being in the library, would be an extinction stimulus or an S delta because putting your hand up doesn't really get you anything. So let's look at another example here. Let's say that we have a child who likes to tell stories, and they're going to tell stories in different situations. So our behavior is telling stories. We have two different antecedents listed here under the A. They can tell stories with their friends, or they can tell stories with their parents. So they're in the presence of their friends, they tell the story, and the consequence or the outcome is that their friends laugh. So that would be a reinforcing behavior. If they do the same with their parents, so they're with their parents and they tell stories, maybe you've experienced, you get no laughs, or maybe even they reprimand you for wasting their time or something like that. And this difference in responding comes from the two different antecedents. Our outcome here is that you are more likely to tell stories to your friends, but not more likely to your parents. So being with friends would be an SD, and being with your parents would be an S delta. Now, the textbook chapter has tons and tons of examples that you can go through and practice identifying these different components. We'll go over quite a few of them throughout the lecture, so if it's not quite sinking in yet, don't worry. We're going to keep at it. The terms will become more and more familiar as we practice with them. One of the common setups that we have for controlling stimuli in the lab would be pigeons in an operant box. An operant box just is a controlled laboratory environment that is set up to allow different animals to make an operant response. So here we'd have a pigeon, which are really, really good at pecking at different things. So here we have this little yellow button. And sometimes when they peck the yellow button, they get food, and sometimes they don't. So the situation here is telling us that S delta, so our extinction stimulus, is a red light. And the behavior that we're looking for, the response, is pecking, and then the result at the top here, because it's an S delta, is extinction. They don't get any food. So when the red light is on, if the pigeon pecks the button, they don't get any food. So there's no reward here for pecking that button when the light is red. But if we look at the second option here, we now have an SD. So our discriminative stimulus is a green light. And in the presence of a green light, when the pigeon pecks that button, then they're going to get food. So there's an SR here. And that's just a symbol or another symbol for that C from our original diagram. So it's just telling us that there is some kind of consequence. They get reinforcement for that food. If we were looking at something that was punishment, we would see an SP because there's punishment. So this is telling us reinforcement as the outcome here. Okay, so let's walk through a couple of examples outside of the lab. So you feed your dog Spot each time Spot begs when you're at the dinner table. You never feed Spot when he begs and you are not at the dinner table. Now he only begs when you are at the table. So the SD here would be that you're sitting at the dinner table. S delta would be any situation where you're not at the dinner table. Our next example is when Billy falls at soccer practice and mom is there, he cries and his mom responds with attention. When his dad is there, he tells Billy to get back on the field. Billy cries when he falls only when his mom is at soccer practice. So our SD here is that his mom is at soccer practice, and his S delta is that dad is at soccer practice. And then our last example for now is that Martha works in a group home for individuals with disabilities. Her supervisor comes around about once an hour and praises her if he sees her interacting with the clients. Martha interacts with the clients only when she hears her supervisor approach. So our SD is the presence of her supervisor. And the S delta would be whenever her supervisor isn't present. So we're just picking out which parts are what's happening when they are being reinforced, and what else could be happening when they're not being reinforced. So what's the alternative? Now, our discriminative stimuli work hand in hand with another concept that we've already talked about, which are establishing operations, or EOs. So our discriminative stimulus is a stimulus that is present when a behavior is being reinforced. So it's present either immediately before the behavior is going to be reinforced, or it's kept on throughout the period when it's reinforced. Our EO, our establishing operation, is an event that makes a stimulus more potent as a reinforcer. Both are making a behavior more likely, and more likely specifically at that time when they're present, not in the future. But the SD is giving us the opportunity to get the reinforcer, or it's telling us that we have the opportunity to get the reinforcer, whereas the establishing operation is basically describing our motivation for that reinforcer. So you might remember that we talked about establishing operations as things like being thirsty or being hungry. So if you have a food reward that you can get when a particular discriminative stimulus is present, you're only really motivated to get that reward if you really want food, so if you're hungry. Both of these are necessary to evoke a behavior. So you need to be motivated to do the behavior, and you need to know that you have the opportunity to get that reinforcer. So both are going to work hand in hand for us to be much more likely to do that particular behavior. Now, when we're talking about antecedents, we're talking about evoking a behavior. So our EOs and SDs are working together to make it more likely for that behavior to occur. We're altering the current probability of a behavior. There's another term that seems very similar, the term elicit. We can elicit behavior, but that's specifically going to be applying to respondent conditioning, which will come up in later chapters. So antecedents evoke a behavior by altering the probability of that behavior occurring right now. And eliciting is something we'll pick apart a little bit later on. So when we're talking about A's, we're going to be talking about SDs. We're also going to mention our EOs because the motivation part really helps. And so that's sort of setting up the situation and how likely a behavior is to occur. Our consequences, or the C part of this equation, is referring to our reinforcers and punishers. So like I said, we've mostly been focusing on reinforcers, and we're talking about antecedents making it more likely for something to occur. But all of this also applies to weakening a behavior or making a behavior less likely to occur. I just find that explaining sort of being able to move it in either direction right off the bat a little bit more confusing. So we talk about strengthening first until we have a better grasp on the concepts, but now that we kind of have it under our belts, we can talk about strengthening or weakening a behavior. And when we're differentiating between our antecedents and our consequences, like I said, antecedents are altering the current probability of a behavior. How likely is this behavior to occur right now while the current antecedent or discriminative stimulus is present, while you have the current motivational state that you do because of the EOs? In contrast, consequences, our reinforcers and punishers, are altering the probability of a behavior in the future. So we always talk about our consequences or outcomes, our reinforcers and punishers, as causing a behavior to become more or less likely in the future. So these are overall altering our repertoire, altering our sort of handbook of behaviors that we have available to us. So let's look at some real data where we can see animals learning to discriminate. So kind of like the setup that we talked about at the beginning with pigeons in the box where they have a green light and a red light. Now we're going to be looking at rats, and instead of pushing a button like the pigeon, the rats are pressing a lever. And so the rats' lights, instead of being red and green, are just on or off. And so in this setup, our SD is that the light is on. And when the light is on, if the rats press a lever, then they get food. If the light is off, that is an S delta, and pressing the lever doesn't get them food. And so on the graph here, we have our median rate in responses per minute, basically how much are they pressing that lever. And across the bottom here, we have daily sessions in training, which is basically a measure of time. And so here we see that both responding with the SD and the S delta start at about the same place, but very, very quickly this SD rate goes up. So while the light is on and they're getting food, they're learning that that light being on means that pressing the lever gets them food, so they are more likely to press the lever when the light is on. But because pressing that lever when the light is off doesn't get them food, they're less likely to press the lever when the light is off. So in this case, they're learning to discriminate between the light being on and the light being off, and they're adjusting their behavior accordingly. So discrimination basically occurs when the presence or absence of stimuli is the occasion on which a response will be followed by reinforcement. Basically, the light being on or off was telling us if pressing the lever would get them food or not. So they've learned that pressing the lever when the light is on gets them food, and pressing the lever when the light is off doesn't get them food. And so we can talk about setting the occasion for reinforcement as describing our environmental contingency. Basically, is the light on or off? Or for our pigeons, is the light green or red? So using that terminology, we can say that green light is the occasion when pecking will be reinforced. Or the light being on is the occasion when lever pressing will be reinforced. So the occasion is basically talking about the environment or the conditions in which a particular behavior is going to be reinforced. We can also use the term discrimination to refer to the effect an occasion-setting contingency has on behavior. So I talked about the rats have learned to discriminate between the light being on and off. So it's referring to the effect of the response being more likely to occur in the presence of our SD than in its absence. So the rats learned to only press the lever when the light is on, or the pigeons learned to only peck the key when the green light is on. They've learned to discriminate between two different occasions. And we can use the terminology of stimulus control to describe a change in operant behavior that occurs when either an SD or an S delta is presented. So for a bunch of examples of all of the proper ways to use these terms, we have the light color is functioning as a discriminative stimulus for the pigeons. The pigeon is discriminating the two situations. The light has acquired stimulus control over the pigeon's behavior, or the light is controlling the pigeon's behavior, or the pigeon is responding differentially, for example, making a differential response and discriminating between those two situations. Again, this is a lot of terminology, but hopefully seeing them in sentences and kind of going through a bunch of different examples has helped solidify some of that in your minds. And as we move through the course, these kinds of terms are going to become very, very familiar. Now, the idea of discrimination kind of ties into knowing when to make a response and when not to make a response. And that kind of makes me think of the Stroop Effect. And this is basically a demonstration of cognitive interference in what we say and how we say it. You've probably had to do this before, you've probably seen this done before, where you have a list of words, they're all color words and they have different colors. And so in the first box here, we say the color of the word. So the word is blue and it's in the color blue, so you'd say blue fairly quickly. Pink, it's colored pink and the word says pink, so you'd say it fairly quickly. If we move to the second box, however, we have the word says blue, but the color of the word is red. And we'd see much slower responding to this because we're reading blue, but we're seeing red, and we have to say what color we're seeing, but not what word it is. And there's basically cognitive interference where we see a delay in our reaction time. We have trouble discriminating or trouble responding to the right thing, which is the color of the word, and we have trouble not responding to the wrong thing, which is the letters of the word. So we could talk about the color of the word being a controlling stimulus that influences how fast you say the color of the word. So if it matches the text of the word, then we're going to say it faster, and if it doesn't match, we're going to say it slower. And for a cognitive explanation for those who are interested, this effect might be basically because we have limited resources and we're trying to inhibit or fight against saying what the word says, and instead we're trying to use those resources to find the color, and that conflict is basically using up more resources than we have at the moment. So we see a delay in response, but just a neat little detour because the topic kind of connects. All right, well, if we want to measure discrimination, if we want to measure how well an animal is learning to respond to our SD and learning not to respond to our S deltas, we can actually use a measure called a discrimination index, or sometimes called a discrimination ratio. And it's basically going to give us a measure of the strength of the stimulus control exerted by either an SD or an S delta. So here we're looking at the index of an S delta. So at the top we have our rate of responding when the S delta is present. So back to our pigeon example. So when the light is green, then how many or what's the rate at which they peck that key? Our S delta rate is how often are they pecking that key when the red light is on. If our SD rate and S delta rate are the same, basically if there is no discrimination going on, then we'd see an ID of 0.5 because it would be sort of 1 divided by 1 plus 1, so 0.5. If we see a value very close to 1, that's telling us that there's a high rate of discrimination because it would be 1 divided by 1 plus close to 0 for our S delta rate. And the idea being that we respond a lot during the discriminative stimulus and very little during our S delta. If we see anything any lower than 0.5, that's telling us that our S delta rate is very high in comparison to our SD rate, and that there's probably something going on, because if our S delta rate is higher than our SD rate, if we're specifically looking at reinforcement, which is what most discrimination research is going to look at, then there's something going on here, something's wrong. So in a standard reinforcement procedure, you want higher than 0.5, closer to 1 is better. All right, so we've talked about discrimination, where we're telling the difference between two stimuli, between a red light and a green light, but that kind of brings us to another term, which is stimulus generalization. And generalization is almost like the opposite of discrimination, where discrimination is like you're telling the difference between two different stimuli or between multiple different stimuli, and generalization is when you are responding to multiple stimuli the same way as you would to your SD. So one definition or one reference to stimulus generalization says that it's the tendency for behavior to occur in situations different than the one in which the behavior was learned. So if we think about the pigeons in a box and they're pecking a button, and they have different colored lights that come on to tell them when pecking that button gets them food or not. For this case, at the bottom here, they have a CS, and that's just operant experiment terminology for basically our discriminative stimulus. And so here, that discriminative stimulus is going to correspond with a particular wavelength of light, say somewhere in the yellowy green range. And so that very precise wavelength is what was what was present when pecking that key was reinforced. So they've learned that this specific wavelength frequency is when pecking that key should get them food. So in this experiment, they would be testing the next stage after they've been trained to recognize that particular frequency as a discriminative stimulus. They would then go and test them in an extinction phase where no matter what color light they see, they don't get food because you don't want to change and teach them something new. So what we would do then is see what happens if you shift the light a little bit lower in wavelength or a little bit higher in wavelength. What if you make it more green, or what if you make it more yellow? And so if the pigeons were discriminating between their originally trained stimulus and another color, then they would have high responding to what they had originally been trained on and very low responding on everything else. But what we tend to see are these stimulus generalization gradients, where we see the highest responding on their discriminative stimulus because that's what they learned gets them food, but we also see pretty high rates of responding on either side of that original stimulus. So they'll also respond to yellow colors because that's pretty close to the greenish yellow that they were trained on. And they'll respond pretty high to green colors because that's pretty close to yellowish green as well. And the further away that we get from that original wavelength, the less and less responding that we see. And so that's what this axis here is high responding versus low responding. Now, generalization and discrimination are both going to be referring to the precision of our stimulus control. Discrimination referring to how precise the control is, and generalization referring to sort of less precise control or applying it to more situations. So don't think of generalization as, say, a bad thing. Sometimes you want generalization. Sometimes you want a behavior to occur in multiple different, slightly similar situations. So generalization isn't necessarily bad. It's just going to be less precise or less structured than when we're looking at discrimination. If we want to bias a behavior to be more generalized, then we can do our training in more settings with more stimuli. So you can have a wider array of different discriminative stimuli to work with. And we can kind of tell the difference between something with more of a discrimination side of things and more of a generalized side of things based on just the steepness or the peakedness of their generalization gradient. So if we go back to our pigeons here, we would see that their first generalization test was a lot higher, it's a lot peakier. So that would be a little bit more generalized. The second one is a little bit shorter and it's not necessarily any wider, but it's at least shorter, so maybe it's more, this would be more discriminative. And then this might be more generalized. It's kind of hard to tell. It looks like one, they just responded less. But usually when we're looking at stuff and talking about it being a discrimination versus a generalization, you get one that's a really big peak and one that's kind of a flat, wide curve. And this is just telling us that at the very tip of the peak would be the originally trained discriminative stimulus, and they respond to a lot of things that are fairly close to it. Whereas here, they'll respond to their originally trained discriminative stimulus, but they drop off in their rate of responding very quickly as the new presented stimuli get further and further away from what they were originally trained on. And if we want to use the framework that we've been using so far in this lecture to talk about discrimination training, we can set it up like this, where we have our discriminative stimulus is seeing a large dog. Our response is that the child says dog. And our response is going to be to praise the child. They got it right. If we want to look at discriminating between dogs and other things like ponies and goats, then seeing a pony or a goat would be an S delta, where if the child says dog to either of those, the parents don't praise them because they didn't get it right. Maybe they would correct them and tell them what it is instead. And the outcome of this is that the child is more likely to call a large dog a dog, and a lot less likely to call anything that isn't a dog a dog. Now this next slide has a typo. It's supposed to be generalization training. I just forgot to change the title in your slides, but I have caught it here. So if we wanted to look at the setup for generalization training, then maybe our discriminative stimulus is going to be multiple things. We're going to have multiple discriminative stimuli to try and encourage generalization. So if a child sees a large dog, or a small dog, or a medium dog, or dogs of different colors or shapes or whatever, and the child says dog, then the parents can praise them. And because we have a broad array of discriminative stimuli, then the outcome is that the child is more likely to label any dog as a dog. Now, why might we actually care about their ability to discriminate between different things? Well, we might be looking at something like concept formation, which is kind of a fancy way to talk about a stimulus class. Basically, how does an animal group objects? Which items fall within the category that they think is a discriminative stimulus? Which ones do they respond to? And which ones fall outside of that category? Which ones do they not respond to? So if we stick with pigeons, there's lots of really cool discriminative research with pigeons that looks at how they form concepts. So, for example, you can teach pigeons the quote-unquote concept of human. Basically, you can set up an operant experiment where instead of a red and a green light, we have pictures that do or don't contain humans. And so maybe whenever there's a picture of a human on a screen in their operant box, if they peck a key, then they get food. But if there's a picture with no humans in it, if they peck that key or button, then they don't get food. So pictures with humans would be our stimulus class, and it would be full of lots of discriminative stimuli that are pictures of humans. And if they form this concept of human, then they will be more likely to peck when other pictures that have humans show up later on, when they get tested on the concept. And then they'd also be less likely to peck for the pictures that don't have humans because they don't fall within that particular concept. So concept formation from that description is going to be a generalization within classes of stimuli. So setting up our stimuli class of pictures with humans and pictures without humans, and discriminating between different classes of stimuli. So discriminating between our concept that falls under that discriminative stimulus, and not responding to the one that is our S delta. And our quote here states that, strictly speaking, one does not have a concept, just like one does not have extinction. Rather, one demonstrates conceptual behavior by acting in a certain way. So we can see the evidence of concept formation by looking at differential responding in pigeons to different kinds of stimuli. Do they respond more to one group or one concept and less to the other group or concept? And if they do, then we have some idea that they have, or that they've formed this concept that helps them distinguish between those two categories.